There's a border that freezes in winter, a river thin enough in places that you could almost hear voices from the other side, and it separates two worlds so different they might as well exist in separate centuries. On one side, the 25th largest economy on Earth. On the other, a state so isolated that satellite images show it disappearing into darkness at night, as if the land itself has chosen to vanish. For 70 years, this border has held. But borders are not permanent features of geography. They're agreements, enforced by power and circumstance. And when circumstances change, agreements collapse. What keeps Chinese strategists awake at night isn't the question of whether North Korea might one day implode. It's the certainty that when it does, every option available to Beijing leads to catastrophe. Understanding this nightmare requires us to start not with military strategy or diplomatic theory, but with something more fundamental: the physics of human desperation. When systems collapse, people move. They move toward safety, toward food, toward any horizon that promises survival. And they move fast. This isn't abstract. It's been documented across continents and centuries. In 1994, when Rwanda descended into genocide, 2 million people crossed into what was then Zaire in a matter of days. The international community, caught completely unprepared, watched as refugee camps became breeding grounds for disease, violence, and regional instability that would spark wars lasting decades. The camps themselves became militarized zones where those responsible for genocide regrouped, rearmed, and launched cross-border raids that eventually pulled multiple African nations into what became known as Africa's World War. Over 5 million people would die in the conflicts that followed, making it the deadliest war since World War II. And it all began with a refugee crisis that nobody had adequately planned for. In 1971, when East Pakistan erupted into civil war, 10 million refugees poured into India within months, creating a humanitarian crisis so severe it precipitated military intervention and the birth of Bangladesh. India, faced with the economic and social burden of housing and feeding millions of displaced people, made the calculation that military intervention to end the conflict was preferable to indefinitely managing a refugee population that threatened to destabilize its own eastern provinces. The decision transformed the geopolitical map of South Asia permanently. The pattern repeats: Syria, 2011 onward, where over 6 million refugees fled across borders, triggering political earthquakes across Europe and fundamentally reshaping electoral politics in nations thousands of miles from Damascus. The refugee crisis became the defining issue in elections from Germany to Hungary to Britain, contributing to the rise of nationalist parties, the Brexit referendum result, and a fundamental questioning of the European Union's open border policies. What began as a civil war in a middle-income country in the Middle East ended up redrawing the political landscape of an entire continent. These aren't isolated incidents. They're expressions of a fundamental principle. Large-scale human displacement destabilizes not just the immediate region, but the entire international system. And the mechanisms are predictable. Refugees strain the economic resources of receiving states, particularly when those states are unprepared or unwilling to absorb them. They create social tensions between host populations and newcomers, especially in regions already experiencing economic stress. They generate security concerns, both real and perceived, as host governments worry about militancy, crime, and loss of control. And they create political pressures that can topple governments, shift electoral outcomes, and fundamentally alter national policies in ways that persist long after the immediate crisis has passed. North Korea, if it collapses, would follow this pattern, but compressed, intensified, and aimed directly at China's northeastern provinces. The geography tells the story before any analysis begins. 25 million people live in North Korea, but they're not evenly distributed. The population concentrates along the Chinese border, clustered in cities and towns where the Yalu and Tumun rivers separate the two countries. These rivers freeze solid in winter. The Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge at Dandong, which carries the majority of trade between the countries, becomes a choke point, a symbol of connection that could transform overnight into a symbol of siege. Conservative estimates suggest that in the event of total regime collapse, between 3 and 5 million people would attempt to cross into China in the initial wave. Not over years, like the Syrian exodus, but over weeks, perhaps days. The psychology of this migration is rooted in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that fundamental framework for understanding human motivation. When basic survival needs, food, water, physical safety, are threatened, every other consideration becomes secondary. Ideological loyalty, fear of punishment, attachment to place, all of these dissolve in the face of existential threat. North Koreans, if the regime collapses, would be facing exactly this situation. The state provides food rations, maintains order through coercion, and controls access to resources. Without the state, the distribution systems collapse, the coercive apparatus fragments, and survival becomes an individual rather than collective endeavor. In that moment, the calculation is simple: stay and risk starvation or violence, or move toward any place that offers hope of food and safety. Why north and not south? The answer is brutally simple but worth understanding in detail. The demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea is one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth, layered with landmines, razor wire, and artillery positions that have been maintained in a state of combat readiness for 7 decades. It's not a border designed to be crossed. It's a border designed to kill anyone who tries. The DMZ is 4 kilometers wide and stretches 250 kilometers across the peninsula. It contains an estimated 1 to 2 million landmines, planted by both sides over decades. The Joint Security Area, the one point where North and South Korean forces stand face to face, is so tightly controlled that even accidental crossings have triggered exchanges of fire. For a civilian attempting to cross, the DMZ represents near certain death. The Chinese border, by contrast, has been porous for years. Smuggling networks operate across it, trading goods, information, and occasionally people. North Koreans who've defected in recent decades often speak of the Chinese border as familiar territory, a known quantity. Some have family connections across the border, ethnic Koreans who live on the Chinese side. Others have heard stories from traders or soldiers who've crossed legally and described what lies beyond. When survival is the only calculation that matters, humans choose the familiar over the fortified. They choose the path where they've heard stories of others making it across. They choose the river they've seen from a distance over the minefield they've been taught to fear since childhood. This is behavioral economics in its rawest form. Humans under extreme stress rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts based on available information, and the available information about the Chinese border is that people have crossed it and survived. China's northeastern provinces, Jilin and Liaoning, are not prepared for this. They couldn't be. The border infrastructure was designed for a trickle of defectors, individual refugees who could be managed, detained, or in some cases quietly repatriated. The border security apparatus is designed to prevent illegal entry, not to withstand a humanitarian tsunami. And these provinces are themselves struggling. They're China's Rust Belt, regions experiencing economic decline, population loss, and the social stresses that come with industrial obsolescence. The factories that once drove growth are shuttering. The state-owned enterprises that employed millions are downsizing or closing entirely. Young people are leaving for opportunities in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing, creating a demographic crisis where those who remain are disproportionately older, less educated, and less economically productive. What remains is an aging population, diminished economic capacity, and an infrastructure already strained. The economic indicators are stark. Liaoning's GDP growth has lagged behind the national average for years. Youth unemployment runs higher than in coastal provinces. Property values have stagnated or declined. Local governments carry heavy debt burdens from infrastructure projects launched during more optimistic times. These are provinces that need investment, migration of skilled workers, and economic revitalization. What they would receive in a North Korean collapse scenario is the opposite. Millions of people requiring immediate humanitarian assistance, straining local hospitals, schools, and social services. The fiscal burden alone would be extraordinary, but the social and political consequences would be even more significant. Then there's the ethnic dimension, a complexity that turns a humanitarian crisis into a potential security crisis. China is home to roughly 2.3 million ethnic Koreans, many concentrated in the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, which sits directly on the North Korean border. These are Chinese citizens, families that have lived in China for generations, but they maintain cultural and linguistic ties to Korea. They speak Korean at home, maintain Korean cultural practices, and have family connections that span the border. In the event of a mass refugee influx from North Korea, the social dynamics become unpredictable. Does solidarity emerge, with ethnic Koreans in China demanding that Beijing accept refugees and providing assistance themselves? Does resentment build between ethnic Koreans and Han Chinese, as the latter group sees resources being diverted to help non-Chinese? Does Beijing face pressure from its own Korean minority to open borders wider, creating a political challenge to central authority? History suggests that refugee crises don't just strain the resources of receiving states. They fracture social cohesion, activate xenophobic political movements, and create internal security dilemmas that persist long after the initial crisis passes. Germany's experience with the 2015 refugee influx illustrates this clearly. Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision to accept over 1 million refugees driven by humanitarian considerations and labor market needs triggered a political backlash that empowered the Alternative for Germany party, shifted the entire political spectrum rightward, and contributed to Merkel's eventual decision not to seek re-election. The social tensions that emerged, fears about crime, cultural integration, strain on social services, proved more politically powerful than the humanitarian arguments for accepting refugees. And Germany is a wealthy, stable democracy with strong institutions and a history of successful integration. China's northeastern provinces have none of these advantages. Beijing understands this. Chinese strategic planners have wargamed the North Korean collapse scenario extensively, and what they've discovered is a trilemma: three options, none of them acceptable, each leading to consequences that threaten core national interests. These war games, conducted by military and civilian strategists, have explored every permutation, every possible response, and every outcome. And the consistent finding is that there is no good option. Every path leads to catastrophe of one form or another. Let's walk through them, one by one, understanding not just what they are, but why they fail. Option 1. Open the gates. Accept the refugees, establish temporary camps, provide humanitarian assistance, and work with international organizations to manage the crisis. This is what liberal international order suggests a responsible great power should do. It's the humanitarian choice, the one that demonstrates compassion and upholds international norms around refugee protection. China could point to precedent. It accepted refugees from Indochina during the 1970s and 80s, though in far smaller numbers and under conditions it could tightly control. During that period, roughly 300,000 refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia entered China. Most were ethnic Chinese, and most were eventually resettled to third countries or repatriated. The numbers were manageable, the population was culturally familiar, and international assistance helped offset the costs. But accepting millions of North Korean refugees would be something else entirely. Start with the economics. The European Union spent an estimated $50 to $100 billion dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis, spread across multiple countries and over several years. That figure includes direct costs like housing, food, and medical care, as well as indirect costs like additional policing, social services, and integration programs. China would face comparable costs, concentrated in its poorest provinces, over a much shorter time frame. The infrastructure requirements alone, temporary housing, food distribution, medical care, sanitation, would dwarf anything China has dealt with domestically. Building camps for 3 to 5 million people would require construction on a scale typically associated with major cities. Each camp would need water systems, sewage treatment, electrical power, roads, administrative buildings, and security infrastructure. The Chinese military could provide some of this rapidly, but sustaining it over months or years would require civilian resources that the northeastern provinces simply don't have in surplus. And this isn't just about money. It's about disease vectors. COVID demonstrated how seriously Beijing takes public health security, implementing lockdowns that seemed incomprehensible to Western observers. The Chinese government's approach to pandemic management reflects a deep-seated fear of uncontrolled contagion, rooted in historical experiences with SARS, avian flu, and other outbreaks that threatened to spiral beyond government control. The prospect of millions of people crossing borders, many of them malnourished, many carrying diseases endemic to North Korea, but controllable in China, represents exactly the kind of uncontrollable variable that authoritarian systems cannot tolerate. North Korea has experienced periodic outbreaks of tuberculosis, hepatitis, and other infectious diseases. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making populations more vulnerable to illness. The camps themselves, with populations living in close quarters, would become ideal environments for disease transmission. The risk of an epidemic crossing from refugee camps into Chinese population centers would be seen by Beijing as an existential public health threat. Then there's the political dimension. Domestic public opinion in China is strongly nationalist, and, polling suggests, would be deeply opposed to accepting large numbers of North Korean refugees. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy rests on two pillars: economic growth and social stability. Opening borders to millions of refugees threatens both. It creates visible strain on local resources in provinces already experiencing economic decline. It risks social unrest if ethnic tensions flare. And it sets a precedent that could undermine Beijing's narrative about sovereignty and non-interference. If China accepts responsibility for North Korean refugees, acknowledging that when a neighboring state collapses, China has obligations to accept displaced populations, how does it maintain the position that foreign intervention in what it considers internal matters, including Taiwan, is unacceptable? The logic would work against Chinese interests in multiple scenarios. If humanitarian crises create obligations to accept refugees, then China's own internal policies, particularly in Xinjiang and Tibet, become subject to international scrutiny in ways Beijing cannot accept. This is the psychology of authoritarian governance, studied extensively by political scientists like Barbara Geddes, whose research on authoritarian regime survival has demonstrated that these systems face fundamentally different incentive structures than democracies. Authoritarian regimes survive by projecting strength and maintaining control. They're risk-averse in ways democracies are not, because the consequences of visible failure are existential. A democratic government can lose an election and its leaders can retreat to private life. An authoritarian government that loses control can face revolution, and its leaders can face imprisonment or death. This creates a powerful bias toward decisions that preserve control, even when those decisions create other problems. Beijing cannot afford to be seen accepting humanitarian burdens that destabilize Chinese provinces, enrage Chinese citizens, and call into question the party's ability to manage national security. The risk of appearing weak or losing control outweighs the international reputational benefits of appearing humanitarian. So option 1, for all its moral appeal, is politically impossible within the decision-making framework that governs Chinese Communist Party behavior. Option 2, seal the border, militarize it, authorize lethal force, and make clear that entry will not be permitted under any circumstances. This is the fortress strategy, and it has precedent. Hungary in 2015 erected fences and deployed security forces to prevent Syrian refugees from entering, creating images that shocked much of Europe, but which Hungarian leadership defended as necessary to protect sovereignty and security. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán framed the issue as defending European civilization and Hungarian national identity against a refugee wave that threatened both. The policy was domestically popular, helped Orbán consolidate power, and inspired similar responses in other countries. China could do the same on a much larger scale, deploying the People's Liberation Army to the border with orders to prevent crossings by any means necessary. The military capacity exists. China could mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops to the northeastern border within days, establish fortified positions, and enforce a complete seal. The immediate problem is the image catastrophe. Modern communication technology means that footage of desperate people at fences, of families attempting to cross frozen rivers, of security forces using force to push back refugees, would be global news within hours. Smartphones with cameras, satellite communications, and social media platforms ensure that no border is truly closed to information, even if it's closed to people. China has spent decades trying to cultivate an image as a responsible great power, a nation capable of leadership on the world stage, an alternative to American hegemony that offers development without interference. That image would be incinerated. The comparison point here is Myanmar's treatment of Rohingya refugees in 2017. International condemnation was immediate, severe, and lasting. Myanmar faced sanctions, reputational damage, and became a pariah state. Its military leaders were charged with genocide in international tribunals. Its economic integration with the global economy was set back years. China has far more to lose. Its economic integration with the global economy, its diplomatic ambitions, its aspirations to lead in international institutions, its Belt and Road Initiative requiring cooperation from dozens of countries, all of these rest on being seen as something other than a nation shooting refugees at its borders. But even setting aside the reputational damage, the fortress strategy fails strategically. Sealing the border doesn't solve the problem. It just moves the problem to the other side of the fence. Refugee camps form on North Korean territory, visible to the world, creating a humanitarian disaster that invites exactly the kind of international intervention China wants to prevent. South Korea and the United States, presented with a mass humanitarian crisis on the peninsula and Chinese refusal to address it, have both moral and strategic incentives to act. Humanitarian organizations, unable to access refugees through China, would pressure their governments to create access through other routes. Media coverage of the crisis, showing desperate populations trapped between a collapsed state and a sealed border, would generate political pressure in democratic countries for some form of intervention. The vacuum created by North Korean state collapse and Chinese border closure becomes an invitation for other powers to step in. The very thing Beijing wants to avoid: foreign military presence on the Korean peninsula moving closer to Chinese territory, becomes more likely, not less. And there's an internal security dimension that Beijing's planners cannot ignore. China's ethnic Korean population, watching fellow Koreans suffering on the other side of a militarized border, potentially dying from starvation or exposure, becomes a source of potential instability. The psychology here is about identity and perceived injustice. When people believe their government is committing or enabling atrocities against those they identify with ethnically or culturally, radicalization becomes more probable. Not certain, but more probable. The research on radicalization patterns shows that perceived injustice against one's group is one of the strongest predictors of both protest activity and, in extreme cases, violence. Beijing would face the prospect of internal dissent, protests, and potentially organized opposition in precisely the border regions where stability is most critical. The Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, sitting directly on the border, could become a center of resistance to central government policy. Even if the vast majority of ethnic Koreans remain loyal Chinese citizens, a small minority engaged in protest or resistance activities would require significant security resources to monitor and control, diverting attention and capacity from the broader crisis. Option 3. Military intervention. Send the People's Liberation Army across the border, establish a buffer zone or stability zone in northern North Korea, secure key infrastructure, prevent refugee flows at the source, and effectively occupy part or all of North Korean territory. This is the option that looks most like decisive action, most like great power behavior, most like taking control of an uncontrollable situation. And it's the option most likely to trigger a wider conflict that could spiral beyond anyone's ability to manage. History is instructive here, and the lessons are consistent across different contexts and eras. Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1978, intending to quickly overthrow the Khmer Rouge regime, install a friendly government, and withdraw. The invasion itself was successful. Vietnamese forces captured Phnom Penh within weeks and drove the Khmer Rouge into the countryside. But what followed was a decade-long occupation that cost tens of thousands of Vietnamese lives, drained economic resources, and left Vietnam internationally isolated. The Khmer Rouge, supported by China, Thailand, and indirectly by the United States, waged an insurgency that Vietnamese forces could never fully suppress. The occupation became a quagmire, and Vietnam's withdrawal in 1989 left behind a weak government that took years to establish control. The costs in blood and treasure were far higher than initial projections, and the strategic benefits were questionable. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 with similar logic: stabilize a friendly regime, prevent chaos on our border, secure a strategic buffer zone, and withdraw once order is restored. We know how that ended. A decade-long quagmire, 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, hundreds of thousands of Afghan casualties, economic devastation that contributed to the Soviet Union's fiscal crisis, and a generation of Afghan fighters who became the nucleus of terrorist organizations that would threaten not just the region, but the world. The Soviet experience in Afghanistan has become a cautionary tale studied in military academies globally. The pattern is consistent. Regime change operations, peacekeeping missions, stability operations, whatever you call them, they follow a trajectory. They're easier to start than to finish. They cost more than projections suggest. They last longer than plans assume. And they rarely achieve their stated objectives because stabilizing failed states requires not just military force, but political legitimacy, economic reconstruction, and social reconciliation, none of which external occupiers can provide. For China, military intervention in North Korea would face all of these problems and more. The operational scenario is clear enough. PLA forces cross the Yalu River, move south to establish control over key cities and infrastructure, particularly nuclear sites, and create a zone where refugees can be contained and order maintained. Chinese military planners have studied this scenario extensively. They know where key military bases are located, where nuclear facilities sit, where government buildings and weapons depots can be found. The initial military operation would likely succeed. North Korean forces, faced with state collapse and lack of command and control, would be unlikely to mount organized resistance. But what happens next? Who governs this territory? China would be occupying land that both North and South Korea claim, land that the international community recognizes as Korean, not Chinese. Beijing would need to establish a civil administration, restore basic services, maintain order, and manage a population that has been indoctrinated for 70 years to view China with suspicion at best and hostility at worst. The costs of occupation, based on Rand Corporation studies of post-conflict stabilization, could easily exceed $2 trillion over a decade, using Iraq as a model. And Iraq, at least, had oil revenue to offset some costs. North Korea has almost no economic resources of value. Its mineral deposits remain largely unexploited due to lack of infrastructure and technology. Its industrial base is outdated and dysfunctional. Its agricultural sector cannot feed its population even in good years. China would be occupying a failed state with no economic means to support itself, meaning the entire cost of maintaining order, providing food and services, and rebuilding infrastructure would fall on Chinese resources. For provinces that are already economically struggling, this burden would be crushing. Then there's the coordination problem with South Korea and the United States. And this is where the scenario becomes genuinely dangerous. Does China inform them before intervening? If yes, do they consent or do they immediately mobilize to prevent what they see as Chinese territorial expansion? South Korea would face intense domestic pressure to respond. Reunification, even under chaotic circumstances, has been a national dream for 70 years. The South Korean military would likely deploy northward to secure territory and prevent Chinese expansion, creating a situation where Chinese and South Korean forces are moving toward each other with unclear boundaries and rules of engagement. If China intervenes without coordination, does Beijing risk military confrontation with ROK and U.S. forces, who might be conducting their own operations to secure nuclear materials, provide humanitarian relief, or prepare for reunification? The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 offers a sobering comparison. Great powers managing client-state crises in close proximity, with nuclear weapons in play and communications that can be misinterpreted. The margin for error becomes vanishingly small. In 1962, the United States and Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than at any point in history. Because both sides were managing a client-state crisis, Cuba for the Soviets, Turkey for the Americans, and communication broke down. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made decisions based on incorrect assumptions about American intentions. President John F. Kennedy was receiving conflicting intelligence and pressure from military advisors pushing for strikes. Neither side fully understood what the other would accept or where red lines actually lay. The crisis was resolved through backdoor diplomacy and mutual concessions, but it required leaders on both sides willing to step back from brinkmanship and, crucially, time to negotiate. Whether such leadership would be available in a North Korean collapse scenario is uncertain. The political pressures, the speed of events, the presence of nuclear weapons, and the stakes involved all suggest that managing great power coordination would be extraordinarily difficult. And unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which developed over weeks, allowing time for communication and negotiation, a North Korean collapse could unfold over days, compressing decision-making timeframes in ways that increase the risk of miscalculation. And at the heart of Chinese strategic calculations sits the reunification question. Beijing's nightmare scenario isn't just North Korean collapse. It's a unified Korea aligned with the United States, bringing U.S. security architecture directly to China's border. This is the ultimate strategic loss from Beijing's perspective, and it explains why every option is evaluated through this lens. German reunification offers the historical analog that Chinese strategists study obsessively. Soviet leaders in 1989 and 1990 faced exactly this dilemma. Allow German reunification and watch NATO expand eastward, or intervene to prevent it and face international isolation and potential conflict. They chose to allow it, and from Moscow's perspective, the consequences were exactly as feared: NATO expansion, loss of buffer zones, strategic encirclement, and a fundamental shift in the European balance of power that disadvantaged Russia permanently. Chinese strategists have studied this history intensely and drawn clear lessons. Allowing reunification under terms favorable to your adversary is a strategic error with permanent consequences. If China intervenes militarily in North Korea, game theory suggests that South Korea and the United States will respond, either by accelerating their own operations or by supporting partition arrangements that prevent full Chinese control. The result could be a frozen conflict, a new division on the peninsula with Chinese forces permanently stationed in the north, a massive, ongoing military and economic commitment with no clear endpoint. This trilemma: accept refugees and destabilize your own provinces, seal the border and invite international intervention, or intervene militarily and risk quagmire, isn't theoretical. It's built into the geography, the economics, the history of the region, and the broader context of great power competition. To understand why China has no good options, we need to zoom out from the immediate crisis and look at the geopolitical chessboard, because the North Korean collapse scenario doesn't exist in isolation. It sits at the intersection of multiple strategic competitions, historical grievances, and power dynamics that shape every decision. The U.S.-China relationship exists in what the historian Graham Allison has called the Thucydides trap, the pattern throughout history when a rising power challenges an established power, resulting in structural stress that often leads to conflict. The Greek historian Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, identified this dynamic 2,400 years ago. It was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Allison's research identified 16 cases over the past 500 years where a rising power challenged an established power. In 12 of those cases, the result was war. Ancient Athens and Sparta, 16th century Spain and Portugal, 19th century Britain and Germany, 20th century Cold War superpowers managing proxy conflicts. The pattern recurs because the underlying dynamics are consistent. An established power perceives a rising power as threatening its position, its interests, and the international order it constructed and benefits from. The rising power perceives the established power as trying to contain its legitimate growth, deny it its rightful place, and preserve an unjust status quo. Both sides take actions they see as defensive but which the other sees as aggressive. Trust erodes. Communication becomes difficult. The space for miscommunication and miscalculation expands. And small events can trigger crises that spiral beyond anyone's control. North Korea functions as a tripwire in this competition. For China, it's a buffer state, preventing U.S. military power from reaching directly to Chinese borders. The historical memory of the Korean War, when U.S. forces pushed north toward the Yalu River and Chinese forces intervened to push them back, remains vivid in Chinese strategic thinking. That intervention cost hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives, but achieved its objective, keeping U.S. forces away from Chinese territory. For the United States, North Korea is both a nuclear threat requiring management and, potentially, an opportunity. If the North Korean regime collapses, the United States could support South Korean reunification efforts, bringing a U.S. ally to China's border. This isn't speculation. It's how Washington has framed Korean policy for decades. The U.S.-South Korea alliance includes contingency plans for reunification, and American strategic thinkers have written extensively about the benefits of a unified Korea aligned with the United States. The nuclear question complicates everything. Would the United States accept Chinese military occupation of North Korea if it meant preventing loose nuclear materials from reaching black markets? Or would Washington see Chinese intervention as unacceptable expansion, requiring a countermove regardless of nuclear risks? The answer likely depends on timing, communication, and the specific circumstances of the collapse, all variables that cannot be predicted or controlled. Regional powers complicate the picture further. South Korea has dreamed of reunification since the peninsula was divided in 1945, but confronting the reality would be economically and socially devastating. Germany's reunification cost estimates exceed $2 trillion over 3 decades, and East Germany was far more developed than North Korea. East Germany had functioning infrastructure, an educated population, and industrial capacity that could be modernized. North Korea has none of these advantages. Its infrastructure is crumbling, its population is malnourished and poorly educated by modern standards, and its industrial base is decades out of date. South Korea's economy, despite its remarkable success and status as the world's 10th largest, would struggle under the burden of integrating 25 million people living in conditions of extreme poverty, malnutrition, and ideological indoctrination. Surveys suggest younger South Koreans are less enthusiastic about reunification than previous generations precisely because they understand the costs, and because they've grown up in a prosperous society where the idea of shared Korean identity has less emotional resonance than it did for their parents and grandparents. Japan faces its own set of security concerns about any instability on the Korean peninsula. Refugee flows could reach Japanese shores. The distance from North Korea to Japan is short enough that desperate people in boats could attempt the crossing. Nuclear materials could fall into uncertain hands, creating a direct security threat to Japan. And Chinese military presence in North Korea would fundamentally alter the regional security balance, bringing Chinese forces closer to Japanese territory and potentially disrupting the military calculations that have kept Northeast Asia relatively stable for decades. Japan's pacifist constitution and reliance on the U.S. security umbrella mean Tokyo has limited options for unilateral action. But Japanese policymakers would be intensely concerned about outcomes and would lobby Washington heavily to protect Japanese interests. Russia, historically important in Korean affairs as one of the original architects of the peninsula's division, now finds itself sidelined but retains spoiler capacity. Russian influence in North Korea has declined as China has become the dominant external power, but Moscow maintains diplomatic relations and some economic ties. In a collapse scenario, Russia could potentially provide support to factions within North Korea, complicate Chinese or U.S. operations, or use the crisis to extract concessions on other issues. Mongolia, often overlooked in discussions of Northeast Asian security, is geographically vulnerable to instability. Sandwiched between China and Russia, dependent on both for trade and transit, Mongolia would face pressure from Beijing to support Chinese positions while trying to maintain its hard-won independence and democratic system. Each of these actors has interests that don't perfectly align with either China or the United States, creating a multipolar complexity that makes coordinated action even harder to achieve. And hovering over all of this is the nuclear question, the wild card that makes every scenario potentially catastrophic. North Korea possesses an estimated 30 to 60 nuclear warheads and the fissile material to produce more. The exact numbers are unknown. Intelligence agencies can estimate but cannot confirm. In the event of state collapse, securing these materials becomes an immediate priority for everyone involved. But coordination on nuclear security requires trust that doesn't exist. The comparison point is the Soviet collapse and Operation Sapphire, when the United States worked with Kazakhstan to secure nuclear materials after the USSR dissolved. That operation succeeded because it was negotiated carefully over time, with cooperation from newly independent states eager to rid themselves of nuclear weapons and normalize relations with the West. Kazakhstan's leadership saw nuclear weapons as a burden rather than an asset and welcomed American assistance in removing them. A North Korean collapse would offer no such luxury. The time frame would be compressed, possibly days rather than months, to secure materials before they go missing. The number of nuclear sites is uncertain, intelligence estimates vary, and North Korea has proven adept at hiding facilities. And the potential for miscommunication or unauthorized use is catastrophically high. If North Korean military commanders facing state collapse decide to use nuclear weapons rather than lose them, or if materials are sold on black markets to raise money, or if rival factions fight over control of nuclear assets, the consequences extend far beyond the Korean Peninsula. The psychology of nuclear security explains why even a minor probability of terrorist acquisition makes this everyone's nightmare. The consequences of nuclear materials reaching black markets, whether flowing to terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, rogue states seeking nuclear capabilities, or simply to the highest bidder in an arms bazaar, are so severe that they override virtually every other consideration. A single nuclear weapon detonated in a major city could kill hundreds of thousands, cause trillions in economic damage, and fundamentally transform international relations. The probability doesn't need to be high for the risk to be unacceptable. Even a 5% chance of nuclear materials going missing would be enough to justify extraordinary measures to prevent it. But preventing this requires coordination among powers that fundamentally distrust each other, and coordination requires time, communication, and agreement on objectives, none of which can be guaranteed in a collapse scenario. The nightmare scenario for Beijing isn't that North Korea might collapse. It's that when collapse comes, every response option makes things worse. For China, for the region, for an international order already struggling to manage the forces pulling it apart. Beijing would face choices between catastrophically bad options, implementing responses that create new crises even as they attempt to manage the immediate one, and discovering that the buffer state they've supported for 70 years has become a trap. And the greatest nightmare of all, that when historians look back on this collapse, it will seem inevitable, predictable, and impossible to have prevented. The signs will have been visible for years. The policy options will have been clear, and the failure to act will appear, in retrospect, as a choice. A collective decision by great powers to hope that an unsustainable situation would sustain itself just a little longer, until finally it couldn't. The frozen river doesn't announce when it will thaw. It simply does, one morning, and what was solid ground becomes rushing water, carrying everything downstream toward consequences no one fully controlled and no one adequately prepared for.